Hi, good afternoon. Welcome, and thank you everyone for joining us on our 7th installment of Geothink&Learn in collaboration with the Open Government Partnership. So my name is Sonia Solomon. I'm the project manager at Geothink. I'll just begin today's webinar by introducing our group of speakers, starting with our panel chair, who will convene today's meeting, Geothink co-applicant Pamela Robinson. Hi, Pamela. Pamela is an associate professor at Ryerson University School of Urban and Regional Planning, as well as the Associate Dean for Graduate Studies and Strategic Services. She's also a registered professional planner. Professor Robinson works on urban sustainability issues, specifically focused on cities and the use of open data and civic technology to support open government transformations. She's an editor of several volumes on urban sustainability and open data and is a columnist for Spacing magazine. So following Pamela, we'll hear from another Geothink co-applicant, Dan Paré. Hi, Dan, associate professor in the Department of Communication, University of Ottawa. So as a co-applicant of Geothink, Dan's research and policy-related work focus on social, economic, political, and technical issues arising from innovations in information and communication technologies in developing and industrialized countries. His areas of specialization include ICTs, international development, e-commerce, internet governance, e-government, and knowledge networks. And Dan is also the OGP's independent reporting mechanism researcher for the implementation of Ontario's Open Government Action Plan. So next up, we have Rob Davidson. Rob is a 25-year seasoned veteran of the software industry. He's a passionate open data advocate, promoting the use of open data for social good and business creation. In 2016, Rob founded the Open Data Institute Ottawa node to help crystallize the open data movement in Ottawa. Rob is also an organizer for the Open Data Ottawa, Ottawa Civic Tech, and Data for Good Ottawa meetup groups, and was on 2 of the Ontario government's Open Government Advisory Committees for Ontario's first action plan. So you'll hear a little more about that momentarily. So Rob has spoken at several national and international events on open data and emerging technologies, and we're very happy to have him here. So following Rob, we'll hear from Clara Woodside, is the Director of Fundamental Freedoms Program of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Clara is a fellow McGill University alum and received her LLB from Osgoode Hall Law School. She also received her Master's of Laws degree from New York University as an Arthur T. Vanderbilt Scholar. So prior to joining the CCLA in 2010, Clara was an associate at a national law firm practicing public law, health law, and commercial litigation. While her work at CCLA is diverse, it includes a significant focus on freedom of expression, state accountability and transparency, and access to information. So following Clara, we'll hear from Lindsay Marchessault as a member of the senior management team of the Open Contracting Partnership. Lindsay is responsible for the stewardship of the Open Contracting Data Standard. In her work, she advises policy and legal reform to implement open contracting and supports the co-creation of tools, methodologies, and feedback loops to ensure open contracting is delivered with impact. So Lindsay is a lawyer who has previously worked with the World Bank, the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, and private practice in Canada. And finally, we'll hear from Rosario Pavese, a program officer at the Government Support and Exchange Team of the OGP. Rosario's primary focus is to provide guidance and assistance to government across Americas, as well as facilitating exchange and learning between governments. So prior to joining OGP, Rosario worked at the Buenos Aires city government, mainly promoting openness and transparency through different projects. She's previously worked in civil society and is currently completing her master's thesis in electoral analysis, law, and management. So welcome, everyone. Now, before I pass it on to our speakers, I'll just briefly outline a few of the features on Zoom that our attendees can use to participate. So first, you can click Raise Your Hand. There's a button on the top left of your screen. This feature would allow you to ask a video recorded question in real time to our panel. So you'll be asked to first accept a video and microphone share request from the service. If you prefer not to ask a recorded question, you can send a written question through the Q&A button, also on the top left of your screen. This same feature has an anonymous function as well if you'd like to keep your name protected. And finally, there is a general chat box that you can access via the chat tab in the toolbar. And we certainly encourage you to chat with our panelists and other participants throughout the entirety of the panel. So lastly, I'll just remind everyone that this will be recorded and disseminated on our website at geothink.ca. And you can also check out our tweets from the event at geothink.ca. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to Pamela.
Hi, and I'm going to keep this very brief. I wanted to say thank you. One of Daniel and I are crossing over from Geothink into the land of the multi-stakeholder forum today. So thank you to our participants for joining us. We've got an interesting panel of people. We're excited about your interest, and we hope you'll help us promote the webinar and the work of the multi-stakeholder forum after this, because we've got 4 weeks left to provide real and meaningful, significant input in this first window. So over to our first speaker. Thank you.
Well, hello, everybody. Daniel Perry here. What I want to speak to you today is about civil society engagement with regards to the province of Ontario and its pursuit of its Open Government Action Plan. And one of the things that has become very apparent in the Ontario context is the difficulty of actually getting public engagement. The government, it has to be said in Ontario, throughout the consultation process in developing its action plan, went to great lengths to try to secure public engagement with civil society groups, including things like online surveys, in-person meetings, a host of different consultation efforts. Unfortunately, one of the key characteristics of many of these efforts was very limited public engagement. So we have an issue that basically the engagement tended to come first and foremost from a niche community of open data, open government activists, or those with an interest in it. But moving beyond that is proven to be quite difficult and quite a challenge. Within the context of Ontario, through the consultation process and ongoings, the Ontario government had set up 3 advisory bodies for each of its commitments. And within each of those advisory bodies, for the sake of discussion today, there's roughly 12 to 13 people per committee. And on each committee, there was roughly half of that would be individuals from different society interests, different civil society interests. But again, participation there fairly limited. So what we encounter, I would suggest to you, is on the one hand, the classic conundrum of, yes, the ideas of open data and open government, by and large, people being, those ideas appealing to them, but there's a difference between being sort of appreciating the idea versus actually becoming engaged in the idea. So the actual engagement presents a whole host of problems. The other aspect of that being as well that people not necessarily always seeing the connection between perhaps their specific civil society interest and what the connections are to open data and open government. So I think trying to strike that engagement aspect is going to be a continuing challenge as we move forward.
Thank you, Daniel, for those comments. Now we're going to next move over to our next speaker, which will be Rob Davidson. One of the great things about this process is it's incredibly transparent, and we get to watch all the steps along the way. Rob, once you're all set, don't forget to unmute your microphone too.
Yes, that's what I just did. Thank you. Okay, so I'm set up now. And can you see my screen, Pamela? Hope so. Okay, perfect. Okay, so what I want to talk to you today about is, really why open government now? Just to begin with, why are we even talking about this? And as you can see on this chart on the right-hand side, this is the Edelman Trust Barometer. And if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, you can see, as an example, what the state of trustworthiness in Canada of NGOs, not very high. You look back on the left-hand side and you can see that it's really been dropping from essentially a neutral position to a non-trust position over the last couple of years. So there's really a need for government to do some things that really reposition where democracy is at this point in time. And to my second point here, there's no longer just this is not just a benevolent initiative anymore for government to look good. This is more about government needing to embrace open government for relevance and viability. And they're having to deal with things like pace of societal and technological change, and it's really outpacing their ability to respond to it on their own. So this idea of co-creating and working with the civil society in its broadest sense really is for their own good. And really, why now? We're not alone in this, because there's a global movement very much orchestrated by the Open Government Partnership to help each other bring these open government initiatives forward. And just to kind of say, well, why do we really need civil society involved in this process? And it really comes down to engagement and co-design of what is necessary to fix the key economic and societal issues that we're dealing with as nations. And that civil society really can bring operational expertise and strategic vision to areas that the government do not necessarily have those skill sets in. And for really focusing in on what we can do for working with the government through civil society is really changing this from a broad open government is good message to thematically driven action around the key issues that we want to deal with, whether it's homelessness or poverty reduction or economic development in remote communities. These are the sorts of things that we need to leverage open government to accomplish. And so in a Canadian civil society context where there has been a lot of stuff put on civil society over the last few years as far as how they now have to acquire funding, sort of more demands on the application process, more battle. Really, they're really competing for money from the public sector and the private sector. And so there's really a fracturing of the Canadian civil society movement. And we really need to come together to move forward on this opportunity to leverage the open government initiatives. And just to kind of talk a little bit, and this goes to some of the stuff that Dan was just talking about, is for the past action plans, and for Canada, we've had 3 already. And from an engagement level in the past plans, the first was really driven by a very high-level advisory panel. That was in the 2012 timeframe. In the 2014 timeframe, there was the second action plan, and there was an advisory panel and also some limited consultation to physical events across the country, but they weren't necessarily much more than informational for those participants. And I have provided in the presentation a link to the IRM report from that time period, where it really outlines the fact that, just like Dan was saying about Ontario, Daniel was saying, that there was not a lot of public participation involved in the development and implementation of that action plan. Okay, and now on the third plan, which was the most recent and really was through to 2016, the consultation, there were consultations in person, there were online consultations, but there still wasn't a driving force to really engage with the broader civil society and particularly around the issues. And a lot of the commitment development for the action plan really came from within government departments rather than what they were necessarily hearing from the public in general and from civil society. So one of the things as part of that process, and actually part of a commitment, they decided to form a multi-stakeholder forum where there's 8 members from civil society, 4 members for government, to really work together to move the open government action plans forward in a more participatory and engaged way. With that, there's also online surveys and comments going on, and also online roundtables. These are all happening right now. And as Pamela mentioned, they're only going to be really occurring for the next 4 weeks. And so I will point you in a couple of minutes to a couple of those events. And just to kind of outline what the multi-stakeholder role really is, and it's really about this forum engaging regularly to track the progress of Canada's commitments, identify potential new areas of focus, and help raise awareness of the open government issues across Canada. And this is key because there's not necessarily a connection between what open government is and how that can benefit the general public and, you know, and just the regular people on the street. How does this help? And so that we really need to start connecting through civil society to the broader audience. And just to kind of paint the picture, what we're dealing with as a timing perspective, I'm trying to break it right down to the basics. As of March 25th, that's really the end of the engagement cycle. So when we say there's 4 weeks left, there's probably less than 4 weeks left based on that date. But this is where we're focused to get as much engagement over the next few weeks from civil society to influence the building of the action plan. And that in May, we are expected to have a draft set of commitments from the action plan and to get that out into the public for consultation purposes for essentially review of what's being proposed. Themes for 2018-2020 action plan. So this is the current action plan. There's a lot of things that we're looking at, and we have working groups on each one of these areas. Typical things that you would expect to see on open data, open science, financial transparency and accountability, beneficial ownership, which has really been in the broader international press from a Canadian perspective a lot lately through talking about how Canada is a haven for money laundering in a lot of ways. And the term they're using is snow washing. Access to information reform that's been going on. How can the Indigenous groups be involved in this open government process through reconciliation and their own data sovereignty? Also looking at things like data needs for social and charitable sector. What does this mean to the cities and urban development? And you can start thinking about what this means to all the smart city initiatives that are going on out there, and how does open government interface to that? Entrepreneurship and innovation, inequality and inclusion. And, you know, if you start looking at real issues around the, and sort of the proposal from the federal government for this feminist open government agenda, how does this work and how can we include commitments that help solidify that in a positive sense? Even talking about stuff around how can service delivery from the federal level be improved through using open government. So these are a kind of a frame of the themes that we're looking at for this term, and a lot of the events that are being constructed and have already been conducted by the federal government are around these themes. And so really to kind of draw attention to how you can contribute, I want to draw attention to a couple events that are coming up. On March 7th in Calgary, there's a workshop on the changing technological context of open data. So that one is in person, and you can sign up off of the open.canada.ca open government site for that. Also, there's a roundtable on feminist open government on March 8th. That's an online one. And I believe through this webinar process, we'll be able to post our presentations. So these are all have the links to this so that you can do this. Also, an important one is inclusive policymaking on March 15th online. And a really big one kind of rounding out the session is on fiscal transparency and accountability. And that's on March 22nd online. And if you want to essentially just make comments and make suggestions for the current consultation that's going on those themes that we've discussed, or on essentially ideas that you have that should be included, you could go to opencanada.ca, go to the open dialogue section, follow the links to current consultations, and then you can provide your comment directly to the federal government and to the open government team. And the idea being that as of March 25th, that will be closed for comment, but please, if you can, contribute to that. So just wanted to go over those things, and that's it from my end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Next, we'll move over to our colleague Rosario, who's able to join us from the Open Government Partnership, not the Ontario Government Partnership, the Open Government Partnership, and she's joining us from Buenos Aires today. Thank you, Rosario. Over to you.
Hi, thank you so much. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you. As you have been saying, the role of civil society is strategic in this open government process. So I wanted to share some specific information around OGP, and then of course I will be available to give you any further assistance. I will share my screen now. Give me just a second. Can you see it? Yes? Okay.
Yes, I can. Yes.
Great. Well, let's see. I like to say that the best part of OGP, of the Open Government Platform, Open Government Partnership, is that it's a platform for action, and that its spirit is based on the collaboration between civil society and governments. So this partnership was created around 6 years ago. It's, as you may know, an international multi-stakeholder platform, and it's formed by governments and also by NGOs who participate and work together in the creation of action plans. And as you know, it is also governed by civil society and by governments. Partnership started with 8 founding governments, and it has been growing very fast. Nowadays, we count with 75 countries and 15 local governments, and 5 more local governments are joining this year. So the partnership is growing, and that's important because it shows the will of many governments, and also the work that many NGOs and representatives from civil society have been doing, pushing governments to get into the partnership. The joke, the best part of OGP is that it's an unique model, because it's based on the partnership between government and civil society. And we also include an independent report, which is an evaluation of the action plans that these stakeholders create. As I told you, OGP is a platform for action, and so that implies that many different coalitions or even declarations or international conventions can be applied through OGP action plans. And another thing I like to say about the partnership is that its flexibility, it also makes it very unique, as the real action is in the countries. We have some standards, but both government and civil society are the ones who decide in each country how they will implement and how they will co-create the action plan. So how OGP works? First of all, we need the will of a government to get into the partnership. And as I told you, this has happened many times, many occasions, by the advocacy that NGOs have made. So nowadays we count with 75 countries and 20 local governments. So if the government is eligible, we have some criteria, some basic criteria for governments to enter. They have to express their will, and once they are accepted, the first thing they have to do is to develop an action plan. And I told you that the spirit of the OGP is the collaboration between civil society and governments, and the heart is the action plan, because that's where all the will become action and concrete commitments that will be measured and monitored both by CSO and by the independent report mechanism. So this, you're actually in the process of co-creating commitments and action plan. You have started the process this year. In Americas, 13 countries will be doing the same. Some of them have started as you have, and some others are in the process of deciding which is the methodology and the strategy they will implement. So once you have defined that methodology, the cooperation starts. And luckily this year, well, last year, Canada has defined the multi-stakeholders forum. Those forums are very important for us because that implies that there's an equal representation between governments and civil society, and they can make decisions about the process together. So that consensus is key for the process, and it's what gives the legitimacy to the whole action plan. So why do we care about OSHP and what it can give to you in the process? We believe that the partnership is very strong in the sense that countries working together in alliance do a better work. They have been learning a lot through the years about what the neighbors are doing. The partnership is also very important to enhance high-level political commitment. And we are also very, very focused on promoting peer learning and support. So you have mentioned the themes that you're already working on this action plan. So these themes can be as diverse as the problematics problematics that you have defined in the country or in the government. But just here to share with you some of the themes that have been addressed in the action plans. We have, of course, anti-corruption commitments, and the first action plans in the partnership were more focused on hard institutional reforms. But luckily, this has been changing, and now we are seeing more commitments focused, for example, on service delivery, or for example, in inclusion. So this means that we are still working transparency, participation, and accountability, but we are doing it thematically and focusing real problems of the citizens. So here, just to show you some examples of commitments that we have had around the world. And as you may see, we have some related to climate change. We have beneficial ownership. We also have commitments related to civic space. OSHP, the IRM, the Independent Report Mechanism, has this category, which we call STAR commitments. So I would invite you to go into the OSHP website, and you will find some nice examples of ambitious commitments that you can take a look at. As I told you, OSHP is a platform for action. So that means that we can relate the process to many other initiatives. For example, the Sustainable Development Goals, which can be worked with commitments and through the action plan. So we always encourage you to think which other initiatives the country is prioritizing, because this could be linked and strengthened. Finally, I would have to leave you some resources. I will share this presentation and the links through the chat, but if you're interested in having more information, there are some tools we have to offer. We have, of course, our website. We have an OSHP Explorer where you can navigate through all the commitments. There are also some key documents. For example, we have a point of contact manual. It is very focused on the process and the deadlines and the calendars, but if you want more information, it's always useful. We also have some co-creation standards. These standards were developed from good practices that we have had during the years. So they establish the minimum requirements that OSHP ask for the co-creation process. We also have an OpenGov guide, which can be helpful. And I also invite you to follow the social media. And we also have a civil society mailing list. That's important because you will receive all the updates and invitations related to events, call for proposals, and everything. So that could be it from my side. And I'm open to answer any questions or continue talking.
Thank you very much. So next I'm going to move over. Rob, you've covered both of your things together, right? So we're moving our agenda around a little bit. Is that right, Rob?
Yes, I decided to do that. Sorry about that.
That's good. No, I'm just checking to make sure. So next we're going to move over to Lindsay Marshall, who's in Winnipeg today, and she's going to reflect on her experience with the previous OGP process. Over to you, Lindsay. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I will also try to share my screen. Oh, what's going on? Share screen. Okay. And what is going on? Sorry, learning how to do things. I shared in the chat the links that you will see on the slides on this page. So feel free to go and follow them along. I've tried not to do too many slides or try to throw too much information, but just so that everybody on the call is aware, this is not the first time that Canada has done a national action plan for open government partnership. I think Rob mentioned that this is currently the 4th plan, so that implies there was a 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. I think one thing that the Canadian government has done a good job on is publishing information about the progress that they're making on the previous plan. So Canada's 3rd action plan, if you want to find out what was committed to and what the progress have been, I've included 2 links on the slide and I put them in the chat. Basically, there were 22 commitments, and Rob talked a little bit about what was the engagement process to get to those and what can and could not be improved about that process. I kind of grouped it into 14 themes that I saw when I read through the midterm assessment report: access to information, open data, open science, open government skills and performance, open heritage, geospatial information, publication, grants and contributions, procurement and spending, service delivery, Canada Revenue Authority engagement strategy, corporate transparency, extractive transparency, open dialogue and policymaking, and the promotion and support of openness around the world. The midterm assessment report, which of course is the midterm, so there's been even more progress since that time, indicates which ones have made progress, how they've made the progress, and what the next steps are. And the government has also set up a tracker. The government team also set up a tracker that is intended to put more up-to-date information about what the progress has been. I think that one of the reflections that I had when reading through is kind of thinking, okay, of all of these commitments and all of the progress that's been made, what have been the most impactful and what are the ones that matter? And one thing that I found a little bit difficult was when I was going through the tracker, some of the indicators that I saw there weren't necessarily the indicators that would be measuring the most impact. For example, I think under the open science commitment, where the spirit of the commitment is really all about how can government employed and funded scientists feel free to speak freely about their work and about their findings, and the indicator being more about science information being published as open data. And that's just from my memory, so apologies to anybody if I got that wrong. But one of the things that I'm curious to hear the views of people on this call and throughout the engagement process is, what would be the commitments and the indicators of success that would really matter and show a difference that open government can make in this country? I have only one more slide, and it's just a reiteration of some of the recommendations that came from the OGP support unit to Canada. So there were 5 recommendations. These are very high level. There were more details in the written document, but I took this image because I thought it was very succinct. Just that there could be more consultations and co-creation standards in the consultation. And that's the period of time that we're in now for the 4th action plan, that there could be more resources allocated to making sure that commitments could be implemented, that there can be more work with First Nations engagement in particular, that access to information reform is an incredibly important priority from the view of the international community and the OGP platform, and that harnessing Canada's open data expertise to craft solutions to integrate information databases. So that one's a very specific one about open data. I think I will end it there. I hope that this has been helpful and that those links are helpful, because I really am interested to hear what people think about the progress made on OGP so far. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lindsay. And so next we're going to move at warp speed over to Clara Woodside, who is going to talk to us about our thematic focus today, which is access to information. Over to you, Clara. Thank you.
And just a reminder to unmute your microphone there, Clara, when you're ready.
Thank you. Yeah, that's the part I was having trouble finding. Okay, so I'm just starting. So I'm just going to do an overview of access to information, which, as Rob and Lindsay had mentioned, is one of the areas that's been a significant one in past action plans, and also an issue that we want to think about and work on developing, you know, a meaningful commitment going forward. So for those who don't know too much about access to information, because it is sort of a very related to open government, but different from open data, which a lot of people, I think, in the open government movement are more focused on. So Canada was a leader in access to information legislation. We were one of the sort of early adopters of legislation, but we haven't updated the legislation really since it was first created in the 80s. So what our system does is it allows individuals, and they have to be either citizens or permanent residents of Canada, to request information from government. There's a $5 fee for making the request, and so you have a sense of how outdated the system is. Until recently, often you had to send a $5 check in with your request. So the Act is intended to give access to information, to government information to individuals, but it includes a long list of exemptions and exclusions for things like cabinet confidences, advice and recommendations to ministers, things that may be harmful to national security or public safety or foreign relations. So sort of broad categories of things that are open to quite a bit of interpretation. The Act also creates the Office of the Information Commissioner. It's an officer of Parliament, and complaints can be made to the Commissioner about requests that have been refused or requests that have been answered with redactions, about failure to comply with timelines or excessive fees being charged. And the Commissioner can themselves also initiate complaints and conduct investigations. And under the current legislation, the Commissioner can issue a report with findings and recommendations, and it's up to government to decide whether they'll comply with that or not. The information we have is that government does very frequently comply with the recommendations of the Information Commissioner, and the Information Commissioner does periodically take the government to court if they fail to do something, or the complainant, the initial complainant or requester can do that and go to federal court. So why does access to information matter? So it's important for democratic participation. In order to hold government to account, we need to understand what they're doing and how they're making decisions. And it's been crucial in a lot of different places. So you know, I have just a couple of examples here, things that we want to know about as civil society. You know, how is money being spent when we host a large international summit? How do we find out how police are dealing with sexual assault complaints? These are things that have been the subject of access to information requests and investigations. And our courts have also recognized the importance of access to information. The Access to Information Act is considered quasi-constitutional by the courts, and they've talked about it being not a right that's protected by the Canadian Charter, but that it's derivative of freedom of expression, and that it's it can sort of amount to a violation of the Constitution if you can't get information you need in order to meaningfully participate in democracy. So there have been calls for modernization and promises of reform. The calls for modernization have been happening for many years. And the Information Commissioner herself, we have a new one right now in Canada, just in the last 2 days, I think she's taken office. But the former Information Commissioner, Suzanne Legault, was a champion of access. In March of 2015, she issued a report that made very comprehensive recommendations to modernize the Act. And the government in their election platform made promises around openness and transparency, including reforming access to information. And I've listed some of what's in their platform here. So elimination of all fees except for the initial $5 filing fee, giving the Information Commissioner powers to issue binding orders, ensure that access to information applies to the Prime Minister's office and ministers' offices, and to the administration institutions for Parliament and the courts, and to conduct a full legislative review of the Act every 5 years. And some of the recommendations that had been made by the Information Commissioner were adopted and reiterated by a parliamentary committee that recommended reforms in February of 2017. The government has said that access to information reform is taking place over 2 phases. So the first is sort of quick fixes to the acts, and that's what we have in the form of Bill C-58, which is currently before the Senate. And phase 2 is a full review of the law, which to the best of my understanding is to begin 1 year after the new law comes into force. I've heard different things about when that review might take place, so it's possible that could begin earlier. But certainly one of the concerns I think that has been expressed is that we keep delaying this reform and this review, and then we have potentially a new government. So that keeps getting shunted back to the end of the list of priorities. In the last National Action Plan, the first commitment that Canada made was this one related to access to information and reforming the Act and engaging in consultation. This is one of the sort of images from the government site about how they've tracked the commitment. So you'll see that they know that they've completed the sort of input phase, getting input from Parliament and the Information Commissioner and stakeholders, and they've introduced legislation. And they say once the first round of improvements has been implemented, they'll undertake a full review of the Act. And it does say here, Bill C-58 provides that the full review would begin within 1 year of the royal assent, so perhaps earlier. There have been negative reactions to this from civil society who feel that the reforms fall short and that they're a broken promise. The Information Commissioner herself issued a report about C-58, who called it in many ways regressive. So there's a disconnect clearly between the government's views about progress on the file and some civil society views of sort of frustration about the lack of progress. So I'm just putting this slide back up. As far as the elimination of fees, except the initial filing fee, that was done, although the new legislation will allow for the potential to increase the initial filing fee. They did, in the new legislation, give the Information Commissioner power to issue binding orders, but there isn't a process in the legislation to certify the orders. And an appeal to the court is sort of a brand new appeal. So that means that if the government institution has refused on certain grounds, they might raise new grounds before the court. So that's a problem. The application to prime ministers and ministers' offices is, there's things about the prime ministers and ministers' offices in the new bill, but it's they're proactive disclosure requirements and not bringing them into the access regime itself. And the Act does include the requirement to review the Act every 5 years. So what we really need from you and others that you know who are interested in this is to figure out where we go from here and what meaningful reform really looks like on this file, and what an ambitious commitment on access to information would look like, bearing in mind the history of the issue and how we can work with government to really make a meaningful change here. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Clara. So Rob, just back over to you maybe for a couple minutes to see if you have any final framing comments, and then we can start to work our way through questions. Does that sound okay?
That sounds great. And thank you everybody for presenting. I think that we have kind of framed what needs to happen in a very short period of time to have an impact on how the government goes forward with this. And this really has to be considered a work in process. And what I mean by that is that we're really not at an optimal state as yet from civil society or even the multi-stakeholder forum perspective to be able to do everything we would want to do. And what we are doing, though, is the fact that this forum now exists and that the members of the forum are cognizant of the fact that we do need to do things better. And part of that is getting the engagement from the communities that are affected and impacted by these themes. And again, I just want to bring to attention the two of the big ones that are upcoming, which are the feminist roundtable. And again, with everything that's happened with the budget and everything that's going to be happening at the G7 summit this summer in Quebec, it's very important to synchronize open government's initiatives with the initiatives that the government is doing in these areas. And the same thing goes for financial transparency and accountability, where there's a lot of stuff happening around that. Even in the budget, there was something in there about releasing Canadians' tax information to international policing organizations to help fight money laundering. That might not be the optimal way to do that. And that's why I think the Open Government has and the Open Government Partnership Action Plan has a role to play in this. And that if we can bring focus to these things and get as many voices as we can to bring unique perspectives and ideas to the table, I think we can get better at doing this and enable Canadians to participate in this process and to help the opening of government, which is really the aspect that's going to benefit both civil society and government as they collaborate on at a more meaningful level on these issues. Outside of that, just want to thank everybody for taking the time to listen in, and looking forward to hearing you during those sessions that are upcoming.
So what we'll do now is we've had people posting questions in the Q&A, and some of our panelists have been answering them in real time. I'm going to take one that's live, and then we're going to go back and just loop in a few more in the next 12 minutes that we've got left. So Bram asks, openness pushes more of democracy's work to the public, who don't always have the time and resources to engage, hence exhaustion, weariness, and disengagement, right? It sounds like there's another piece of the open agenda, which is ensuring that institutions are in place where it's up to someone's job to ingest, sort, filter, and apply what's been opened up, which sounds like the Levitsky-Zablat thing in terms of needing critical institutions. And I think that's a reference to the new book called How Democracies Die, which Renee Sieber has posted on too. So anyone want to answer that? How do we help bridge the gap between openness depending on meaningful engagement by civil society groups, and those groups are busy doing the things that they've organized around already, and maybe not trustful and maybe lacking the capacity to be the full partners in which we want people to participate in? Anyone want to take that?
It's a good question, and it really is one that it kind of cuts both ways too, because the fact is with openness pushes more of democracy's work onto the public. That is true, but it's also part of the realization that the government can no longer do this on their own, that they do not have the ability to keep up with societal changes and technology changes through traditional legislative mechanisms and the like. So that this is really about a culture change within government that enables them to work with these civil society organizations so that they don't have to essentially be so frustrated with the lack of progress, that they're actually being brought into the process right at the beginning and being involved in creating real solutions. And that is the goal. It certainly is at a very nascent state right now, and I wouldn't suggest that it's going to happen in a smooth way, but I think that we're at the beginning of a real sea change that we really need to foster and to find the energy to embrace what open government means and then take that forward.
Can I add just a little bit to that? Because I disagree somewhat with the onus of Rob's response, in that I think that I think in large part, and of course context dependent, but certainly in the Canadian context, I think it's fair to say at the provincial level and at the federal level, we have seen a desire on the part of government to try and engage with this, admittedly to different degrees. For me, the fundamental issue that we're at right now for open government, if we want civic engagement or civil society engagement, is really a matter of civil society organizing itself. Who are the representatives of civil society? What are the interests at stake? How do they input? How do they interact with this? Because we often talk about civil society organizations or civil society interests in a holistic sense, but it's an amorphous entity. You know, who are the legitimate representatives of civil society? What are the issues at stake? And so I think that oftentimes the narrative and the discussion around open government and this government civil society engagement tends to overlook the complexity and the necessity of civil society to engage in the opportunities that are there. Which again, this is to sort of to come to the defense of government per se, but it's to say that that's a very important side of the equation that we risk overlooking or engaging with at our peril in this regard.
I'd be interested to hear from Lindsay, especially because you have different points of contact in civil society in a way that makes this panel more robust. But one of the things I think that is an artifact of being in Canada is that we're geographically quite a big country, but we aren't many in numbers of people. And so what I see in the sectors in which I work, which are largely cities-based and environmentalism-based, there's this differentiation of civil society groups so that people are trying to compete less with each other and trying to keep out of each other's way. So everybody has their own niche so that they can spread the resources that they have around, which means that we don't have a lot of redundant capacity. And so I think there are a lot of civil society groups whose input and wisdom on open government would be really important, but they're really preoccupied doing the basic day job of the thing their civil society group was established to set up. Added to that, we don't have the same foundation sector funding open government and open data and civic technology related work in Canada. Like our foundations aren't funding in the same way that, say, the Americans are. And so not only do we not have as many people, and those people are very busy, but we don't have the independent non-government funding in part to support this kind of work. Anyone else have any thoughts?
I'll just add to that I think that your comments highlight sort of I think one of the key conundrums here in terms of the framing of a lot of open government issue, in the sense that, are we talking here about governance projects or are we talking about openness projects? Where does the onus lie on? In terms of, as you've described, in terms of the role of civil society entities, in many cases, to me, it's a matter of governance of different issues to which openness can come to the table. It's not at the forefront or the driving force of the issues. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm going to go to Majid's comment. And Majid asks, most of governmental institutions act as both promoters and monitors in many third world countries. This could be a source of government corruption too. There's a need to have clear government roles, I think. Does anyone want to take that up or think about what that means in the context of the work that we're doing? Can government both be a promoter and the subject of this kind of work? Go ahead, Rosario, please.
I think that's where the role of civil society becomes even more and more important. What I would invite you at this stage of the process is to think not only about the co-creation process, but how you will engage as monitors and even as co-implementers during the implementation, because that defines pretty much how those commitments will become alive.
Great. Anyone else? No. Okay. Is someone going to jump in?
I was just going to say that I think it's, I don't think it's that government can't be both, but they can't be the only promoter. You know, I think that that's an important distinction. Obviously, I mean, the context I know is Canada, and I have less concerns about sort of full-on corruption in our context, but you know, I think that's why these kinds of collaborations between with civil society and government can be important.
Yeah, I might just echo a little bit to say, because I've worked on OGP commitments related to open contracting in many different countries around the world. And, you know, governments are large and complex, interconnected bureaucracies, and there are checks and balances even within government. So it is very helpful to have government champions, government promoters, and I think we are lucky in Canada because there are people who have it on their portfolio to be promoters and champions of open government in this country, but they cannot be alone. It has to be with the relevant departments, with the relevant civil society groups who are going to say, hey, these are the issues we really care about. We want to work on them. We want to work on them with you. So it takes them all to make it work, and it's not an easy process, but it's well worth doing.
That's great. I'm going to see if we can loop in Clara Woodside, who's also a member of the Multi-Stakeholder Forum. Claire, are you able to get on this? I don't know if we have the technology capacity to do this. Okay, I think maybe not.
Oh, yeah, Claire's on right now.
Great, Claire, thank you for joining us.
Okay, am I unmuted? Yes. I was just going to say that I think it's actually a good question and an important one, because it is, civil society in Canada is incredibly small, and the advocacy community is very, very small and underfunded. So you definitely don't want to end up in a situation where the few advocates we have in Canada are kind of co-opted into a government process, where, you know, the need to work together sometimes supersedes the need to push from the outside. And I think that's something that we're going to have to be wary of as a multi-stakeholder forum, is how do we use it to ensure that we're working with government on issues to move things forward, but we're not just supporting the issues that they already have, or forgetting to be the strong external advocates that we need to be. You know, and so I've worked quite closely on sort of government policy making with government institutions, but always from a position of independence and a sort of a willingness to risk that relationship if need be. I think that's something that's important for all of us to remember who are advocates external to government, is that there's always going to be risks in terms of making the other side unhappy. And we have to be willing to take those risks. Otherwise, you know, the other way is to be complacent to kind of what they want. And that's a little bit what we've heard from them on ETI, you know, is that they're doing a really good job. They've made a lot of progress, and that's excellent. But we know there's still a lot more to do, and the reports in it are clear. And so, you know, there's going to be a role for external advocates in pushing that agenda forward.
Great, thank you. Tracy Loriot, who's also a member of the Multi-Stakeholder Forum, is online. Tracy, you're texting answers to questions on this point. Do you want to weigh in as our last kind of talking point before we wrap this webinar up? We'll give Tracy just a second.
Hi there.
Hi, Tracy.
I just wanted to respond with the idea. I fully support what Claire was saying. I think that's really critically important, that sometimes by being critical, we sometimes have to be direct, and sometimes we have to walk away from some situations, and sometimes we have to say things that may be considered to be very unpopular. But I think I'd also like to echo everything that was said with regards to the overburdened and underfunded civil society sector in the Canadian context. I think we need to remember that the space that we are working in is very specialized space. There's a degree of experience in understanding how government structures work between federal, provincial, municipalities, as well, and in the Ottawa context with the National Capital Commission. The mechanics of government are not that straightforward. And we also have to remember that in some respects, this is a somewhat a technocratic exercise where we're tweaking the machinery of government for the benefit of citizens. And not everybody knows how to do that. And the hooking into that is not easy. And I would dare say that we don't necessarily have a media that's been particularly great at the literacy piece. Even the notion of government, open government, doesn't really show up in newspapers on a regular basis. It shows up on our blogs and in our social media feeds, but it's not showing up as a typical topic of conversation. So really, if we want to bring more Canadians in and we want to bring more civil society in, we have to find a way that contributions can be made in a way where they can be heard and they can be useful, they can be well received, and they're meaningful, as in we can actually see the results of that kind of work. And I think that's not so straightforward.
That's great. Tracy, thank you very much. And you came in exactly on time. We promised our webinar participants we'd be finished at 3:30, and that's the time that we're at. One of the things I think I can confidently say is I pass it back over to Rob to bid everyone goodbye because he's the chair of our multi-stakeholder forum, is that clearly this is just the beginning of a very important conversation, and it's the middle of one that many of us have been involved with for a good long time. So on behalf of the Geothink side of the house, I want to say thank you to Geothink Central in Montreal, to Sonia and her team for organizing this webinar. And I'll pass it over to Rob to say parting comments from all of us on the multi-stakeholder forum.
Thank you, Pamela, and thanks to Rosario from OGP and Daniel from the IRM side of the equation for helping us frame this, and also to all the participants as well that have joined in and will either are experiencing this live or listening to it in some future time, because it will be provided. And just to, again, underline this idea that civil society in Canada is a very specific context, and that sometimes when we talk about engagement, and particularly government-led engagement, we don't do enough to prepare the audience and educate the audience on what's going to happen before that engagement. And that's stuff that needs to be worked on an ongoing basis. So again, thank you for everybody for joining in, and hope you can participate in those upcoming sessions that we've referenced. Thanks very much.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Clara.